All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the first of our four-part series on competency assessment this fall. My name is Eric Brichto, and I am the Vice President of Accreditation Operations and Counsel with CAMI. And to kick this off today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Brad Beauvais. Brad is an assistant professor with Trinity University's MHA program. He is our Standards Council chair and a longtime CAMI fellow and site visitor. Now, a couple of housekeeping items here. We are recording this session, and currently and throughout this session, you will all be on mute. If you have questions as we're going through this, there is an icon in the top middle of your screen where you can write those in, and we will periodically break and take those questions. Now, before we get started, I'd like to make you aware that this webinar series is brought to you at no charge through the generosity of the Don Gideon Foundation. This foundation was founded in 2015. Sorry, I'm getting a little feedback. I apologize. Can other presenters put themselves on mute for a second? Right, thanks. This foundation was founded in 2015 in memory of Dawn M. Gideon, a truly strong and intelligent creative force in life and in her chosen profession. Dawn dedicated herself to working with struggling healthcare providers and finding creative avenues for success. Honoring the memory of Dawn Gideon, a graduate of the CAMI accredited program at the University of Pittsburgh, this series serves to advance the quality of graduate healthcare management education by sharing best practices in competency-based education. Thanks. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Beauvais.
Well, thanks, Eric. I appreciate it. Welcome. Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you're at. Again, I'm Dr. Brad Beauvais, Chair of the Standards Council for this year. Want to thank not only CAMI for the opportunity to do this, but also to our presenter today, Dr. Forrest Kim, that'll be speaking to you in a few minutes about how the Army Baylor program has basically tackled this issue of competency-based assessment and meeting, or how the program has met basically CAMI criteria. Before we get going, though, I think it's important to kind of set the stage for why we're doing this in the first place. As you know, for anybody that has been affiliated or has sought CAMI accreditation over the past several years, CAMI and the DOE has really pushed very steadily towards competency-based education, competency-based assessment, which sounds good, of course, but we're finding is somewhat difficult to achieve. So with that, that was kind of the genesis behind these webinars and helping the field basically to understand how some programs have tackled this issue and recognizing that no two programs are alike, no two competency models are necessarily alike, none of the faculty are alike. So at least hopefully this process can help generate some good ideas and generate some good discussion on how competency-based assessment can perhaps be advanced in your own programs. So just for some background and understanding of where we've been and where we are going, the last round of criteria in 2013, one of the specific areas that we'll be focusing on as part of this discussion is this issue of 3C3, which reads that the criterion itself reads the program will regularly evaluate the extent to which students and graduates attain the competencies and use the evaluation for continuous improvement. Now, Eric has done a great job in basically going back retrospectively over the past several rounds of accreditation for all the programs that have sought either accreditation or reaccreditation. And you can see where we have a fairly significant issue with this criterion, where 46 of the 62 programs, or 74%, received a partially met or a not met in this criterion. Now, you should also understand, and hopefully everybody is aware, that we have recently gone through an additional round of periodic updates to our accreditation criteria. And 3C3 now is the new 3C2. The spirit and the nature of the criterion itself really has not changed, and it's still in place. And I would argue, and certainly open for discussion, but really is one of the reasons why, again, we're doing this webinar. And you can see on the screen the 2017 criteria for accreditation under 3C2. Again, the program will regularly evaluate the extent to which each student attains the competencies at the level targeted by the program, and we'll have a process in place for communicating that information to students. So with that in mind, we also have a separate criterion that kind of split apart the original 3C3 into the new criterion at 3D2, where the program will collect, analyze, and use the assessments of student competency attainment for continuous improvement. So really the spirit of the nature of what we're trying to do is essentially, as a student comes into any of our programs, establish or at least evaluate where they are from a baseline sense, what they're bringing in terms of their prior work history or their prior educational history, and then trying to really understand how far they're moving, or how far we're moving the needle in terms of their competency development and competency attainment. So again, there is no necessarily right, quote unquote, right answer for this, but it's one of the reasons why we wanted to set aside a little bit of time and meet with each one of you to discuss how several programs have tackled this issue. So with that in mind, I'd like to introduce Dr. Forrest Kim. Dr. Kim is a former colleague of mine at Army-Baylor and is now with University of the Incarnate Word here in San Antonio as well as the new program director there. And I think he'll really be able to add some great insights into how this process has unfolded for Army-Baylor. So Forrest, floor is yours.
Thanks, Brad. I appreciate it. So I'm just happy to have the opportunity to spend some time with all of you that actually have chosen to participate in this webinar. Today, really what I'd like to focus on as we move ahead are just some lessons learned, as both Brad and Eric mentioned, from Army-Baylor, as I just transitioned about 4 weeks ago from the military and am now at the University of the Incarnate Word. Dan Deming is the program director currently. I'll be transitioning with him this summer into that position. But I think it provides a great case study. I think I'm hopeful that you'll pick up some tools as we have this webinar. And I'm going to start with laying out what we did at Army-Baylor. And then I think you'll find it also helpful that I'd like to share some of the lessons as I've adapted some of those tools at the University of the Incarnate Word. I've titled this presentation, It's About the Conversation, because I really think in terms of competency education, that this is where competency education and assessment needs to go, is really about the conversations that we have with our students, with preceptors, employees, in terms of competency development. I'd like to start off with a quick web poll. On the screen, you see 3 different individuals. And so I really want to help orient and calibrate this presentation to your needs if I can, and get a feel for where you're at with competency assessment. The left-hand side, you see an individual that's pretty happy, pretty content, and that would be A. And so if you're in the category within your program where you feel like you have a pretty good handle on competency assessment, CAMI criteria 3C3, now merging to 3C2, and you're feeling pretty good about it, you would mark yourself as A. If you're actually not feeling very good about competency assessment and CAMI criteria as it relates to competency development, maybe you're a little grumpy, you know that this is a requirement, you have to do it, you would mark yourself as B. Or if you're just kind of terrified about the process, maybe you're just starting the competency assessment journey, haven't done a whole lot in regards to it. Maybe you've got a self-study or a site visit coming up. If you could mark yourself as being C. And so now I'm just going to run the poll very quickly. And if I can get an assessment from you, which picture most closely describes your current feelings about the criteria surrounding competency assessment? So if you can go ahead and mark that. I see folks are filling that out. Most, I think, are leaning towards B and C. Few are an A. Okay, I just give it a minute or so. Okay, well, it looks like B is one out. So most folks in the audience are feeling a little grumpy about this criteria, and that's understandable. This is certainly a new area that we're trying to push forward in, and it certainly gives me some help. Some of you are following the criteria in terms of selected yourself as C. You're a bit terrified about the process. And so I'm really hoping that you'll learn some very practical tools as we move forward. There are three questions, key questions that I'd like you to keep in mind as I move through this presentation. The first is, ask yourself the question, what are the elements of an effective competency assessment program? I'm hoping to share some tools. We're going to lead with a checklist that we've developed at Army Baylor that maybe will help you get started, or maybe even serve as a benchmark to see, do you have the right structural components in place for an effective competency assessment program? The second question I'd like to ask yourself as you proceed through is, what are the outcomes of an effective competency assessment program? Meaning that we're doing a lot of this work, we're putting together these tools, but what do you expect to get out of it? What are the key outcomes that you think should come out of an effective competency assessment program? And then last, as I share the tools and several lessons learned, both from Army Baylor and the University of the Incarnate Word, are there any ones of those that you believe that you can adapt to your program really immediately, so you could do it right away? So I'd like you to keep these three questions in mind as we progress through the presentation. This is the outline of my talk. I'm going to start off with a very brief military history of competency-based education at the Army Baylor program. We've been doing this for quite some time in terms of looking at competencies. And then I'm going to walk you through an approach to competency assessment. As Brad mentioned earlier, there is no quote unquote right way of doing this. I think we're all on our competency assessment journeys, but I'd like you to provide one approach that we've used there. And then I'm actually going to finish up the presentation by talking about how I have adapted several of those tools and principles at the University of Incarnate Word with my colleagues here. I like sharing this picture because it really gives you kind of an idea of the rich history with the Army Baylor program. This is a picture of the graduating class of the Army Baylor program in 1951. So our program goes back 66 years, and it actually has a rich history. We were the 11th program to be stood up in health administration, coming out of the need of World War II vets coming back from World War II, and the need for administrators to run those facilities. And so again, I think it gives you an idea, a bit of a backdrop to the Army Baylor program. This next slide talks about the military history of competency-based education. I'm not going to walk through each of these bullets, but I just want to give you quite a bit of understanding of the genesis of how competency-based education got started with the Army Baylor program. It really came out of a mandate out of Congress. Congress actually looked at the Department of Defense and asked the question, how do you know that the leaders that are running military hospitals are qualified to run those hospitals? And back at that time, Department of Defense didn't have a very good answer to answer that question. And so they were charged with developing a competency model that addressed whether or not military leaders were ready to assume the position of commander or deputy commanders of these facilities. And so that really birthed the Joint Medical Executive Skills Institute, which is in place today. We borrow the Joint Medical Executive Skills Competency Model. It's really been, we've been really fortunate to have external institute to develop the model, to maintain the model. But as you can see there, we've really been looking and working at assessing competency for a number of years. This next slide is a competency assessment checklist. And what the slide really is covering are, I think, several key components of a what I believe are can be an effective competency assessment plan or plan. There's a timeline that I think is very useful, and we'll walk through the different tools in this checklist that are highlighted, that are bold. The second is course to competency map. The third is a tracking tool. I see a message from Carla. Yeah, we'll actually have these slides available. I think Eric will send these out after the presentation. The tracking tool itself, I'm going to give you an example of what the Army Baylor has used. And I see another message. Yeah, we'll also share the tools, and I'll get to that as we go through the slides as well. The tools will actually be embedded within the slides themselves, and so you'll have access to all the documents that you see here in this presentation. The fourth is an advising checklist. Again, I think another key component of an effective competency assessment plan. And then the last are the CAMI syllabus cover sheets. So the ones, again, that are bolded are the ones that I'm going to cover in this portion of the presentation. The ones that aren't, the course to competency map, I think is really key and essential for an effective plan. And really, most of you have done this. And really what that is involved in mapping those competencies that are being addressed within the individual courses of your curriculum. The CAMI syllabus cover sheets, I think, is a very, very effective tool. It's required now, I think, a part of the accreditation process. But that the cover sheet is really helpful in aligning the individual competencies that are assessed within that course, also identifying the deliverables where those competencies will be assessed, and then what level of attainment you hope to achieve within that particular course. And so again, two key components of an effective plan, the course to competency map, as well as the CAMI syllabus cover sheet. We won't be covering those in this presentation, but I think they are an essential element in an effective plan. I'm going to pause here for a minute before I jump into these tools. Are there any questions at this point in time? Okay, seeing that there are no questions, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the tools themselves. And so this next slide shows you that first item on the checklist, which is a competency assessment timeline. And I think that this tool actually is very helpful in laying out where in your program you are assessing competencies. This is the timeline for the Army Baylor program. And what you find is our program is structured a little different from most of the programs that are out there, in the sense that the first year is the didactic phase, where most of the credit hours are actually conducted within that first didactic year of instruction. The second year is actually a one-year administrative residency, where our students go out to facilities and health systems around the country and to a certain extent around the world. And they focus on really development of a portfolio in that second year. What the timeline shows you is all the points where we are assessing competencies as they move through the 2 years of the program. In green, we assess our students. Actually, there are self-assessments. We have 35 competencies within the Army Baylor program, and the students are assessing themselves on a 10-point scale, and you can see that they're doing that at the beginning of the first year, the end of the first year, and then again at the end of the second year. We do have a diagnostic Joint Medical Executive Skills Institute exam. It's a 175 objective exam. It's multiple choice exam. And again, we're fortunate to have an external body that develops the competencies, that refreshes the competencies every 3 years, and as well as has several tools to develop competencies. So we've borrowed several of their questions and developed 175 objective exam for our students. And they take that exam at the beginning and the end of their didactic year. And I believe the Army Baylor program will be implementing that exam again and having the students take it at the end of the residency year as well. As you can see, as they progress through the first year, they're course to competency, and that's really when those cover sheets come into play and the syllabi come into play, where you're mapping which competencies are covered in which of the courses. And as you know, this is where the bulk of the competency development is taking place within the formal curriculum. At the end of that first year in the capstone, we have a strategic management class. And there's a board where groups will present, and again, competencies are assessed at that point in time. And then one of the highlights in terms of competency assessments and best practices, I think, from our program is a comprehensive oral board that's conducted at the end of that first year, where we involve both faculty and external stakeholders in a 5-member panel where we assess competencies, the 7 domains within the Army Baylor competency model. And it's really 45 minutes where we ask questions and the students then respond. It's fairly rigorous and grueling. Our students can attest to that. But again, another way that we assess competencies for the program. Then in that second year, we have quarterly reports that are tied to how the students are progressing through their residency. And then again, the portfolio projects themselves, the students are responsible for identifying which competencies link to the projects that they worked on. And then at the very end, the preceptor then rates the student. So again, a very useful tool. I think if you haven't put together something like this for your program, I think it can be very valuable and provide a lot of information. I use the same tool when I transition, and I'll show you the product that we developed at the University of the Incarnate Word. The other thing that this tool will allow you to do is, as you put the tool together, you can actually put together some type of gap analysis to see, are there certain areas that we probably should be assessing our students that we're not, and then having the conversation among the faculty members of what type of assessment tool then can we incorporate periodically throughout our program. Any questions on the competency assessment timeline? Okay, barring no questions, I'll move to the next slide. I apologize already right now for the eye chart. This is very difficult to read, but there's a purpose for laying out this slide the way that we've done it. What you see in front of you is known as the BEAR. This is the Baylor Experience Assessment Report. And this is an example of a tracking tool that a program can use to monitor the development of our student competencies, again, as they progress through your respective program. What you see at that top row, each of those boxes within the top row of this slide links to an assessment that you saw in the slide before along the timeline. And so that progression is the same progression that you've seen essentially in the timeline in the slide before. And so what we've done in this tracking tool is we've actually allowed each of the columns, again, represents an assessment, competency assessment through the program. And this tool is actually a tool that we orient our students to at the beginning of the year, before even during orientation week. And really what we ask is that the students take ownership of this tool. Oftentimes when we have the conversation with other faculty in different forums through CAMI and a UPA, a lot of the pushback that we've received is, wow, this is a lot of work. And it is a lot of work, I think, to put together. But one point that I really want to emphasize is that this is the student's tool. So a lot of the columns that are there, although the information within, in terms of competencies and where they're at, is provided by the faculty, we really want to emphasize the point of students taking ownership of their own competency assessment. And so this is a tool that the student populates as they move through the program. The other point that I want to bring out is the cells that you see within those tools are really the assessment score that either the student or the faculty or the preceptor are assessing them on, and each of those cells are conditionally formatted. And so the Army Baylor program, we use a 10-point scale, 0 being no competency attainment, 10 being actually an expert. And we've broken out that 10-point scale into 3 different bands, 1 through 4 being that the student assesses their competency at the knowledge level, 5, 6, and 7 at the application level, and then 8, 9, and 10 at the expert level. And so we're using a modified version of Bloom's taxonomy to try to get at where that student's level of competency attainment is. And so as you fill out each of these respective cells, again, they're conditionally formatted. So if we put in a number, the cell will change that color. So again, it's an eye chart, but as a student progresses through the program and they begin to populate each of these different cells, it becomes a graphical depiction of their progress that you can see visually. And so again, it becomes a conversation piece that the advisor can have with the student to identify their areas where that student needs to focus on. So if you notice, very difficult to read, but in the information management, about halfway down the screen, information management and technology, and the second row of the pre-didactic GIMC assessment, that cell is black, meaning that the student didn't get any of the answers right in the objective assessment, in the multiple choice questions. And so again, that may turn into a conversation with the advisor saying, maybe this is something that we need to keep an eye on as you progress through the program. We'll see how you do in our health management information systems class. And again, it should lead to a conversation of that student's development. That screen that you saw was actually one of the worksheets in the BEAR tool. This next screen is actually another worksheet that you'll find within the BEAR tool. And this worksheet is focused on the student's competency attainment throughout the residency year. And so what you'll find in this screen is along the top row actually indicates the baseline at the end of the didactic year where the student rated themselves on our 35 competencies. It becomes the baseline for the rest of the residency year where the student and the preceptor can take a look at the baseline and identify areas to really focus on and develop projects that can enhance student competency development in areas where they may not, or where they may need some work on. And so again, this one is oriented vertically. And so the student will fill it out from the top to the bottom, and each of the rows indicate a key portfolio project or a rotation the students will go through. And again, another tool to track competency assessment as they progress through that residency year. I want to highlight on the bottom left-hand corner is actually when you get the slides, I've embedded the worksheets and the PDF and the Word files into the presentation. And so you'll be able to open these up and modify them and adapt them to your individual program needs. The other thing that I'd like to point out about the BEAR is that what you see, the 2 screens that I showed you before were quantitative assessments. We also have worksheets that we ask the students to qualitatively assess their competency assessments, their competency development in terms of how they're progressing as they progress through their coursework, as well as their projects and rotations through the residency year. The next tool that I'd like to share is a advising checklist. And again, this checklist is with the Army Baylor program. And again, I think it's very useful to have a checklist that defines when advisors should be meeting with their students. And so as you progress down, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here, but we've developed a checklist and some key points where faculty advisors will be sitting down with their students and having the conversations periodically as they progress through the program. It just keeps our faculty kind of on task, and it provides a great checklist to have those conversations and to prompt faculty members to have conversations, for example, about competency development as they progress through the program. And again, if you see in the next slide, provided you with the embedded document on the bottom left-hand corner. You can adapt this to your program needs, and again, another tool that you can use. Okay, so I'd like to show you next a series of outcomes. And so we've done this for a little while, but we've been able to collect outcomes for about a couple of years now. And so the next several slides, I'd like to show you some of the outcomes and what you can do with the data you collect through a tracking tool like the BEAR. So what you see in front of you is actually a compilation of our 7 competency domains. Again, 7 domains, 35 competencies. You can see the breakout of our domains within this chart: military, medical, leadership, organizational management, so on and so forth. And what you see across the bottom of this line chart are the different assessments as they progress through our program. And so what you'll notice is that at the pre-didactic self-assessment phase, students are assessing themselves at the lowest point, which is good. And as they progress through the program, you see a kind of a steady rise in the level of competency development as they go through the program. We were very happy after we collected the data to see something like this. And it just gives reinforcements to us as a program that there is a level of competency development as they're progressing through our program. One thing to note as well, we won't have time during this webinar to address, but in the worksheet that I've embedded in the presentation, we actually have the individual competency domains broken out by the individual competencies. And so another thing that the data allow you to do is actually assess certain individual competencies which may be lacking and lower than the others. So again, the data provides a feedback loop back to the program to look at areas, are there competencies that we aren't addressing very well across the board, and then we could then make adjustments to our curriculum and our program based on the feedback from these data. Let me pause again to see if there are any questions. Okay, pending none, we'll go ahead and progress forward. I'd like to spend a few minutes just to talk through some guiding principles. I showed you 3 of the tools that we use at the Army Baylor program. But again, as we've had this conversation among faculty and members at the program, there are certain guiding principles that have come out as we've gone on our competency assessment journey. One is the point of triangulation, just understanding that there's no such thing as a perfect measure or instrument. A lot of debate within CAMI forums about this. But at the end of the day, you're not going to come up with a perfect instrument. So I think key to competency assessment is really coming up with multiple measures and really looking at quantitative and qualitative measures, and also incorporating multiple perspectives. A lot of programs are using self-assessments, which is one way of approaching the development of a student's competencies. But again, looking to involve faculty, external stakeholders such as preceptors. I think the more angles that you can use, the better picture we can present on how our students are developing over time. The second point is that we want to try to develop some type of tool that consolidates the measures, that tracks them and displays them. I've given you one tool that you could adapt to your program. And again, having that kind of visual display of competency development, I think, is very useful. The third point, it's really important, again, and I've emphasized this again, that the students take ownership of their own competency development. A lot of the tools, particularly the BEAR tool that I showed before, again, that eye chart, faculty members will their initial response to seeing that is, boy, that's a lot of work. I don't know if I can do it. Again, I want to emphasize the fact that that tool is the student's tool to own and manage as they progress through the program. And again, I want to park here. Yes.
A couple of questions we received from Ann Johnson. The average value, is there an average value for the student group?
So no, that's a great question. So the individual BEAR will be just for that student. When we actually aggregated the data, we did that actually hand jammed that information into a spreadsheet. That's when the aggregation takes place for the program. So for the students themselves, we assess them at the individual competency level. And so there isn't necessarily an aggregate score for the student. We aggregate the data for the program. The other other area that where we could look at aggregating would possibly be when we aggregate scores at the domain level. And so some of our assessments, such as the comprehensive oral examination, we don't assess at the individual competency level per student because there's too many to try to assess within 45 minutes. And so for that assessment, we assess at the domain level, the 7 domains, and we ask those panel members to develop questions that will hit on 1 or 2 of the competencies within that domain. So hopefully that answers your question. I can also take questions via email as well if you'd like to discuss that more. Eric, are there any other questions?
Yes, there's a couple follow-ups on that.
Okay.
All right. The first, I'm getting feedback from your computer. Let's see. The first is from Carla Stebbins, and Carla asks, how does the program collect data? She's not sure how this is done. And the second is from Naylan. He asks, how is a competency attainment level from specific courses assessed and entered into the BEAR instrument by students?
Unmuted.
Okay, 2 great questions. The first one, in terms of how the data is collected, the data is really just extracted from the BEAR tool. So the students will go in and individually put in their scores, and then we'll have someone afterwards, like a work study, come in and actually hand jam all the individual student BEARs into a master spreadsheet. And then that's when those scores are aggregated for the program. And so that's where the data are. The second question, which had to do with the course competencies, great question. This is one I think the Army Baylor is still working on. But what we've done is we've used the CAMI cover sheet, again, to help faculty and members identify the competencies associated with that course. A deliverable is tied to that competency. And so at that point in time, I think the thought process is that the faculty are going to take how that student did on that deliverable and then try to come up with the corresponding level or number on that 10-point scale for that competency. So I think that's the thought process that Army Baylor is using. The data that you see in the BEAR are actually scores that the students have put in based on individual competency levels, individual competencies that were tied to that individual course. So again, there's an evolution that's taking place within the Army Baylor program. We think that that's not quite the right, asking students to do that. I think it's putting too much subjectivity in terms of that assessment as it ties to the course. And so I think faculty are going to begin to take that responsibility. So hopefully that answers your question. Let me go ahead and move on to talk about the guiding principles. I want to be respectful of your time. The point that I made early on is that I think even though we've developed several tools, I think really where the discussion on competency assessment needs to go is how can we actually capitalize upon the tools that we use to have conversations, multiple conversations about competency assessment? Because really, in my humble opinion, I believe that's where you make your money, is those conversations that the students have with themselves, right, in terms of looking at self-reflection, that the advisor has with their students as they're looking at the data contained in these tools, that the advisors is having with the preceptor and talking about where the student needs to go in their competency attainment and development, preceptors are having with their students, and so on and so forth. I mean, I picture a time where we can use the information from these tools for the program to have a conversation with a respective employer or even with a current employer, and to say, this is the BEAR tool, this is where the student actually has landed in their competency attainment, and so this is where you're starting from, the starting point of what you're getting with the student. Here's their strengths, here's areas that they can work on. Again, these tools leading to conversations that I think are very instructive for competency development. The next step for the Army Baylor program is to pursue some type of grant funding to automate the BEAR tool. Right now, again, it's a Excel worksheet, and I think the program plans to try to automate that to make reporting as well as data entry easier. And I just left you some references that you can go back that kind of describe our competency assessment journey within the Army Baylor program. So within our last several minutes together, I want to talk to you about several adaptations of this approach at University of Incarnate Word. I have to be a bit transparent with you in sharing that sometimes when we have presented the information on the Army Baylor program, we've heard from programs, and I think a little bit sarcastically saying that you have an unfair advantage in the Army Baylor program because you can order your students to do all this stuff, and you can order your faculty. And so we've kind of laughed about it because we have our own leadership challenges. But I would say that that we do have a bit more control being in that environment. And so what I'd like to do is to talk about what we've done in the University of Incarnate Word and adapting some of these tools in a non-military context to kind of show you that it's possible. And I think, again, what we've tried to do is try to modify these tools to your respective program needs. And I've titled this portion of the presentation, Show Me Your Card. We've adapted the bear tool to the card for the context of University of Incarnate Word. Our mascot is the cardinal, and so I had to come up with a nice acronym to make sure that it matched this program. So again, just following the checklist, we've developed a timeline for the University of the Incarnate Word. I'm going to talk about the timeline, very quickly go over the advising checklist, and then I'm going to show you kind of a bonus feature in developing the timeline, an additional assessment that we have just implemented that I think all of your programs can implement to assess competencies. And so here's the competency assessment timeline for the University of the Incarnate Word. As you notice that we do have self-ratings for our students. Both our program is structured actually a 2-year, a little bit more traditional structure, where our students are in the didactic phase for 2 years. There is a graduate assistantship in the 2nd year, but just note that not all our students actually have to go through the graduate assistantship. It's just those students that do not have healthcare experience or not currently in a healthcare job. And just to let you know, our program is actually targeted towards working executives or working students, typically in early management positions or early healthcare positions. And so if you notice, we have a self-assessment at the beginning and the end of the 1st year, as well as the end of the 2nd year. We have course to competencies, so we've linked the competencies to individual courses. And in our program, the faculty are the ones that will assess those competency attainment for the students. We have the preceptor assessments that take place from the graduate assistantships in the middle of the 2nd year, as well as the end of that 2nd year. And then you notice the students have reports as well. And then we have the exit interview that's tied to our capstone course where faculty assess student competency attainment. The one point that I want to point out is that as we developed the timeline, we noticed that there was a bit of a gap of a more objective form of competency assessment where the student didn't assess themselves at the end of that 1st year. And so what we implemented were mock interviews where faculty will actually assess students in these mock interviews on competency assessment. Because as you notice, at the end of that 1st year, we only had the students assessing their own competency assessments. So we felt like there was a need for faculty to assess them at that point as well. So we instituted mock interviews, and I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. In terms of, I provided another key for the competency assessment timeline, and what you'll notice is these colors correspond to the colors that you saw on the timeline in the slide before. And the other thing that I want to point out is, again, this notion of triangulation. So for the assessments themselves, you see who is making the assessment. So you have a mix of folks that are assessing our students. And then also in the type of assessment, you see that there are quantitative assessments as well as qualitative assessments that are involved as a student progresses through the program. Just a very quick bonus feature in terms of the mock interviews. Again, we implemented this for the first time just a few weeks ago. Found that it's relatively easy to assess competencies related to soft skills, and so some of our coursework doesn't lend itself to assessing things like professionalism, such as business attire or self-confidence. And so this is a great way of doing it. We actually structured our mock interviews for 30 minutes, 20 minutes, question and answer, 10 minutes debrief. I think in terms of timing, a great point of doing something like a mock interview would be maybe after the end of the first year of the program and prior to maybe students looking for jobs such as residencies, administrative residencies, in our case, the graduate assistantships. So it kind of sets them up for the interviews that they may be having as they move through your program. And then again, I think it achieves two goals. One, competency assessment, and then two, preparation for future interviews. And then after we conducted it, we did a debrief with our students and we received quite a bit of positive feedback from them. Really the feedback that they say is typically when they had an interview and they don't have a whole lot, but there's really little feedback. If you got the job, you kind of assumed that the interview went well. If you didn't get the job, then you kind of assumed that the interview didn't go so well. And so this provides an opportunity to provide some very pointed feedback to the student on how they did in that interview. I've attached a PDF file there, a list of questions that we've developed for our program that tie to specific competencies within our program that maybe will give you a running start if you decide to implement this in your program. There's the checklist that we've developed next, the advising checklist. And again, you can adapt the checklist to your needs. And again, it helps keep the advisors and our faculty on track as they progress through our program. And I've given you a PDF of that as well. And then next steps for University of Incarnate Word as I close out. We need to develop that tracking tool. Again, that's on my list of things to do. I've named it the Competency Assessment and Review Dashboard, the CARD after the Cardinals. I had to have a witty acronym for our program's tool. And then the second is, as we've looked at how we are triangulating upon these assessments, realize that we probably need to include external stakeholders. It's predominantly the student, the faculty, and the preceptors that are involved in assessments. And so as a next steps, we're going to start looking at including external stakeholders for the mock interviews as well as the exit interviews to get an outsider's perspective on our students' performance. So that concludes the formal portion of the presentation. I know that we are end of the formal allotted time. The last thing that I would like to note before I take any questions for those of you who would like to remain on the call is I want to again give a shout out to the Don Gideon Foundation for their support of the webinar. Again, without their generous support, we really couldn't proceed with these webinars moving forward and provide them free of charge to CAMI members. So again, thanks to the Don Gideon Foundation. So at this point in time, I think we have another 12 or so minutes left on the call. So I'm happy to entertain any questions that you might have. So Eric, are there any other questions that have come up?
Yes. Lou Horvath asked whether a LMS like Canvas could do this.
Unmuted.
So I think that's a great question, and we do use Canvas at the Army Baylor program. I keep saying we. I'm just making my transition. I'm we at both Army Baylor, but more so we at University of Incarnate Word. But at the Army Baylor program, Canvas is used. That's the learning platform that's used, and the actually assessments and the bear are actually tied as a worksheet in Canvas. So I don't know. Something to think about as a way forward is you may want to use the gradebook within Canvas, and you could probably set it up to where you can do some of these assessments. We have not moved in that direction, although that's a great idea. We're looking at actually developing a separate database that maybe is hosted on the cloud, where you can access anywhere, and to make data entry a little easier. I know some of the learning platforms can be a little unwieldy at times, so we're looking to develop our own. But I think Canvas can be used, and again, we do use Canvas, but it's really just a place to house the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet, the Bear tool. I did see another question. Eric, were there any others that are out there?
Yes. Pia Woodley asked how many competencies the card has.
Unmuted.
So at the University of the Incarnate Word, we have 23 competencies within our competency model. And so I'm just looking to take the Bear. I don't want to recreate the wheel. We're going to take our different assessments and just build them in across the top of the Bear tool, that one worksheet. And then we'll build in the 23 competencies into that tool.
Great. There's several other questions. I don't know if we're going to be able to get to all of them. They're being written in the attendee chat section on the left side of the screen. Lou asked how many students you have.
And so at the Army Baylor program, there was an average of 50 students. So a lot of data to kind of keep track of. Within the University of the Incarnate Word, this year's cohort is 22. So a range between 20 to 23 students.
All right. Naylan asked how you handle competencies such as professionalism that are not tied to specific courses.
So Naylan, that's a great question. I think, again, what we found is the mock interview is a great opportunity to assess some of those softer skills like professionalism. So if you click on the PDF that I've given you, you'll notice that we also assess their business attire during the mock interview. And so as they come in, we'll give them comments. You know, your tie wasn't cinched up properly. One of our students showed up without a coat, without a jacket. And so, again, I think thinking creatively on how to assess the students, I think is key. I think a mock interview could achieve those types of competencies that don't fit very well into a course.
Great. Let's see, I think we have maybe time for one more. And again, any questions that anyone has, please email me at ebricktoe@cami.org, and I will forward these to the questions to Brad and Forrest, and we will send out a list to everyone who attended today with the answers. And see, Brad has also provided his email address. I think we have to wrap up, but thank you for attending the webinar. And I hope if you have not already registered for the next 3 webinars, please do so. Space is filling up fast. And thank you, Forrest, for a very enlightening presentation. It's fantastic. All right, with that, thanks everyone. Have a